Hi everybody, you're through to Hannah, and today I have with me Sebastien de Castell, and we're going to be talking about a book that he's written recently, and it's a prequel to a series of the Spell Slingers. And the book is called The Way of the Argosy. With this series, I haven't yet read it all, but I've read The Way of the Argosy and I found it absolutely fantastic. But I would appreciate it. Sebastien, do you want to take over and tell us more about the book and the series?
Sure, yeah. So Way of the Argosy is very much the story of a young woman named Farius, who is a refugee from a group of people who lost a war 300 years ago. And despite having been largely decimated, are still viewed with both contempt and a certain amount of fear and panic by the society that won the war against them, who are called the Jantep. And the Jantep are all about magic. They're very powerful sort of mages in that sense. And so Farius finds herself as a young woman separated from her people and experimented on by by a cabal of these mages whose aim is to make the remnants of her society sort of so hideously despised by everyone else that they'll just kind of completely die out without them ever being a threat anymore. And so Farius, as a young girl of 11 years old, is first thrust into this world, and we watch her as she struggles over the next 5 years to survive, to try to find some semblance of a life. And she tries to do this by doing a lot of things I think that we all do in our lives when we're really uncertain and stuck. We sort of try to take on these archetypes. So because she is rescued by a pair of knights who turn out to be actually quite nice. Usually when I write knights, they're horrible. But she meets a couple of good knights who sort of try to take care of her for a while. And so she tries to behave like a knight herself, and then finds that fails her. And then she tries to become a thief, and she's good at it for a while, but then ultimately that fails her and she goes on this sort of process until she finally meets a member of this strange group of wandering philosophical gamblers called the Argosi, who are the exact opposite of the sort of the Jantep mages. Instead of being obsessed with magic, they're much more obsessed with very human things, like the things that human beings can do well, like eloquence, right? Which is the fact that we can speak to each other in different languages in different ways is kind of remarkable. And so they elevate eloquence to an almost superhuman ability. Or just when you think of the way human bodies move, right? That we're fundamentally not very good creatures of violence from a physical standpoint. We don't have very good long teeth or very good claws. But then you see a martial artist move or a dancer move, and you see this amazing things human beings can do. And so Way of the Argosy in part is her sort of starting from a place of magic is the most powerful force in the universe, and I've just got to run and hide from it, to a place of look at all these amazing things that human beings can do, and finding her own path within that. So that's kind of a rambling way of putting it together, I suppose. But she's a pretty rambling character, so I suppose it fits.
Well, after meeting one of the original Argosy that she met, Darius, um,
Durrell.
Daryl, sorry,
Darius would be a
Daryl,
great name too.
that would be a cool name. Um, he was very much he kind of fought with his words, didn't he? And it showed in the first scene with him, where he basically disarmed a tavern full of aggressive people, and I was inspired, and I had in my head this kind of Western theme, and I don't know if that's how you wanted it to come across, but I had the Southern American Western accent in my head, and I was like, this character seems like a nice, soft, gentle character, but he's firm and he's very confident, and I loved it. I was drawn to his character a lot. I thought it was fantastic. So yeah, it really came across the way that you wanted his culture to come across. It was really, really interesting that he
Yeah.
talked about the beauty of the world and everything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm really glad to hear that. The Argosi are kind of hard for me to explain sometimes. Well, so Dural is a good example of it, though. So I wanted in part to see, it's very much set in a kind of a frontier
Mm.
civilization. There's all these sort of civilizations, but everywhere in the gaps, you have these sort of frontiers of distrust and a certain sort of roughness to it, and people having to sort of find ways to survive. And Durrell kind of comes across at first like the prototypical, cowboy figure, that sort of tough talking, swaggering, hard drinking, gambling. But the Argosi are actually pacifists, as a general rule. And pacifism is a philosophy that's largely died, I find, in our culture. We all like to talk peace, but the second there's a reason for violence, we are very comfortable with the infliction of violence. We've also gotten completely confused about what pacifism means, because it doesn't mean you just roll over all the time. It means that violence has to genuinely be the last resort, and more importantly than that, it means, and this is where it is for the Argosi, especially Durrell Brown in this book, and what he tries to impart to Farius, is that the solution that avoids violence has to be the one that you value the most. And that's kind of the underlying thing. And because that sort of philosophy, I don't see it very much anymore. I see mostly of a lot philosophy of justified violence in fantasy. And I write tons of violence. I used to choreograph sword fights for the theater. I love swords, and I love good action stories and martial arts stories and all those things. But I see that a lot, and I think because I see so many books that sort of kind of glorify violence, as long as it's violence for revenge, as long as someone's done something bad to you, or your people or whatever. Well, now violence is completely the only way to go. And we see that in the dialogue in the world around us. And so I wanted to see, can I make some pretty heroic figures who are very human? Durrell sometimes really wants to choose a path of violence, but who somehow try to hold themselves to an effort to find other ways around violence. And can I make that as compelling as an action scene? And so that's really what I try to do with Durrell when I can. But also because I think, as I say, even in broader terms outside of violence, we've come to sort of see each other as these kind of entities that commit crimes upon one another, and that the noblest thing you can do is kind of get revenge for those things. And Farius has absolutely every valid reason to want to avenge herself on these people. I mean, these people have been pretty awful. And so when Durrell kind of, on the one hand, is offering her this path, through life, she's tried everything. She's tried to be a knight, she's, and be tough and honorable. She's tried to be a thief and be kind of wily and not care about, the foibles of society. She's tried to sort of be a gambler and risk her life here, where, and there where she has to, and kind of none of it's worked. So on the one hand, he offers her this path, the way of the Argosi. That's like, I can teach you all these ways of getting through life, and maybe even be happy, but it's going to cost you your right to enact the violence that your enemies so richly deserve. And that's just a tension point that, for me, I guess because I'm an old school humanist liberal, I don't drink tea, but I would be a tea drinker. Sorry, that doesn't make sense if you're British. North America, tea drinking is associated with being effete and things like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I'm very much one of those weak-kneed liberals types, and so I wanted to see if I could bring all of the action and adventure and sort of swashbuckling spirit to a story that there's plenty of stuff going on, but is a little bit more focused on, a little bit more aligned with the ideals that we often talk about than the unfortunate reality that we sometimes see.
Yeah, well, I thought the way that you built up the culture of the Argosi, the four ways, I thought that it was from this book, it was astounding at how much depth had been explored into each way, and the way of the thunder was not Daryl's preferred way. I thought that's really interesting. And you were mentioning earlier about violence, and you could see that he is a pacifist because he doesn't want to hurt. He said, "This ain't right, this isn't me," when he's feeling he needs to hurt Farius. And I just thought that was really good depth of character. And then it set the scene perfectly for me when we saw him in the second time.
Yeah, well, so he's interesting, and that was an interesting set of scenes for me to write because, without spoiling too much about the book, Farius is basically branded with these mystical sigils that cause anyone who would otherwise want to help her or befriend her to despise her and want to kill her.
Mm.
And that this is kind of the ingenious sort of solution that the Jean Tep have. They think that this is them being kind, because their thing is, well, rather than eliminating every last Madec, which is the people that Farius comes from, what we'll do is we'll kind of brand them with these sigils that become a kind of a collar that will prevent anybody from taking them in and or helping them or working with them or trading with them. And therefore, that will mean that our society is safe, but we didn't have to literally kill them all. So it's a kind of very vicious interpretation of pacifism.
Yeah.
And so when Durrell is hit with this, because he badly wants to help Farius, and suddenly, and he's hit with the sort of curse that instills this violence. You can kind of see what I found interesting to write about that is that, he's not just fighting against this sort of curse, but also he's fighting against the sort of intrinsic violence that a lot of us feel. It's like the taste of really good steak sometimes when you want to hurt somebody. Like that feel. And so for him, he's sort of fighting both those parts, and in part, it's easy for him to recognize. That's one of the reasons why he's able to sort of resist, because he's been fighting that his whole life, because he wants to be an Argosy. He's wanted to follow that path, and therefore he has to try to find sort of the appropriate solution to a problem. And yeah, you mentioned the four ways, and the four ways is interesting because it came to me early in the process of writing about the Argosy inside the Spellslinger series, and I kind of realized that it's funny. One of the great things about writing fantasy novels, especially when you write fantasy culture, is it allows you to kind of write the things that you sort of missed in your own life in some ways. And I remember like how many times I've been in a situation and just had to react, right? And often reacted the wrong way. And so, and I always think like, oh, I kind of wish that I had. Most people sort of think of a credo, like, if turn the other cheek or something, right?
Yeah.
If somebody hits you, you just turn the other cheek so they can hit the other cheek, right?
Yeah.
But that's sort of monolithic, and it doesn't really work in most situations. Even the greatest single piece of advice ever constructed, do unto others as other you'd have others do unto you, doesn't actually work very well in lots.
No.
There's lots of situations where where if you were sitting by yourself crying in a square in some big city, what you'd really want is some stranger to come up and hug you and tell you it's okay. But there's an awful lot of people in the world for whom that is absolutely the wrong thing to do. It's not what they want. So with the Argosy stuff, I came up with the notion of the four ways, which is that they sort of break down how do you respond to a situation in four different ways. And the way of water is to say, like, just flow around things. Don't take anything, don't steal anything. So, and don't let anything be taken from you. And that's sort of the principle of sort of, you have to constantly balance things. So if I bump into you, I have to apologize, right? Because, otherwise you're just leaving, you've left this negative impression. You haven't flowed by someone else. If I knock you unintentionally and your coffee falls, I should offer to buy that coffee for you, right? So it's those kind of principles. In the same way, if you knock my coffee out of my hands, I should say to you, well, okay, I think you owe me a coffee. So that's the sort of the way of water. And then they have the way of wind, which is to kind of listen to the signs of what's around them and sort of go, okay, what does this mean, right? And so maybe the most important thing about you knocking my coffee out of my hand isn't the loss of my coffee. It's what does that mean? Maybe that's a sign that there's something bigger going on that I should find out. And the way of thunder, which Durrell kind of doesn't like, is very much the way of taking action without permission, in a sense, right? So it's sometimes you have to do something. But the Argosy are very strict about this, which is if you are going to do something, for example, if you're going to commit an act of violence, you don't get the privilege of apologizing for it. You don't get the privilege of minimizing what you're doing. You have to do it swift and mercilessly and take responsibility for what that means. So don't do something that you're then going to want to apologize for. So if you knock the coffee out of my hand because you bumped by, and I then shoved you to the ground, or vice versa, I don't get to pretend that wasn't me. I don't get to go, oh, I just overreacted. Like an Argosy doesn't overreact. They're supposed to, be responsible. And then the last one is the way of stone, which is sometimes you just have to stand firm despite what all the conditions are around you. And so those 4 ways kind of are the way that they view how they're supposed to interact with any given situation. And the reason that they need that is because they're travelers. They travel through all different places and cultures, and you don't know often all the rules of a given culture when you go there. And so you need some set of principles to work by. Anyway, I'm rambling about the Argosy, but I kind of love the Argosy, so that's why I tend to do that.
It's an amazing culture to hear about, and part of me wishes it were real, because it sounds so fair and just. But I mean, obviously you've got so much experience in world building and making it consistent. I wanted to ask my first official question as, when did you first begin writing?
So I first started writing, I think I was one. So, there's those people who say, I wanted to be a writer my whole life. I was, and they wrote their first novel when they were 8 years old or something like that. And they couldn't not write. I was never that person. I was the worst kind of person. I was the person who kept going, I really want to see my name on the spine of a novel on the shelf in the bookstore. That's the worst possible sort of motivation.
There's no shame in that, though, honestly.
Yeah. Well, it can get you into all kinds of trouble, but in my case, I started writing. The first time I tried to write a book was when I was 27. I was in a touring rock band that was playing cover music in bars in every small town in British Columbia, and I was being sued by the bass player, or threatened with a lawsuit by the bass player, to take control of this band that made us each like $250 a week. Basically, we were barely, we were surviving. We were true musicians. We survived on the strength of our music and having girlfriends, or girlfriends or boyfriends. I was just in a pretty dark place in that sense, that I felt like my original band had sort of fallen apart. We weren't doing original music at that point. We were just playing covers. We weren't getting along. So I felt like really kind of creatively in a weird box. And so I did what I kind of always do when life gets too complicated and I don't know how to fix it, which is I went to the library. I adore libraries. I married a librarian. Libraries are kind of like the cathedrals of humanism to me, that they're just like, anyone can go in. They don't ask you why you want a certain book. They don't tell you that you're only allowed to look at certain books. So all of a sudden, all the possibilities in the world are before you. And I went to the Vancouver Public Library downtown, which is in this gorgeous building that was modeled after, that was sort of a pseudo modernist rendition of the Roman Forum or Colosseum. So it's this very beautiful, so it looks very magnificent. And I went to the 6th floor and I found this box of book tapes. So there's this box with like 24 sides of these cassette tapes, which even then hardly anybody was owning cassette players anymore. And it was called Let's Write a Mystery by a guy named Ralph McInerney. And Ralph McInerney was a very successful writer of mysteries. He wrote these Father Dowling mysteries, these kind of, Catholic priest solves crimes kind of thing. And he was also a Catholic scholar at Notre Dame University. So we couldn't be more opposite, because, I'm pretty much an atheist, and I didn't know anything about mysteries, but you'd play these cassette tapes and he would literally walk you through writing a mystery novel while he's writing a mystery novel. And it was like listening to a 1960s science professor. He'd go, today we're going to write our protagonist. He should be a guy you'd like to have a beer with. It's very sort of old school. But somehow he was so kind of effortless in the way that he talked about it, and so sort of non-judgmental, which is sort of the voice we all really need to hear when we're trying to write. That I was able to kind of suddenly write book. I wrote a very terrible mystery novel. And he gave this amazing gift. I think this is the greatest gift a professional writer could give would-be writers. He includes inside the box of tapes the novel that he wrote that while he was doing the course, and it's the worst piece of crap I've ever read. I mean, it was just bland and awful.
Oh no.
But that's the thing. This was a guy who had, I think, 20 or 25 published novels at the time. He had tons of acclaim. He knew his stuff. What he was doing was letting you see what his stuff looks like before he's kind of got it to the stage he wants it to be at. And so showing you what it looks like when a really skilled writer is sort of roughing through their first draft was super liberating for me. And so anyway, I found that a life-changing experience to write that novel, even though it's a terrible novel. But it has a great name. It's called Skeletons in the Cloister. Okay. I remember my agent once saying to me, "Oh, I can get that book published." And I was like, "Yeah, but it's terrible." She hadn't read it. And she said, "Yeah, but that's a great title for a mystery novel."
Yeah, it is.
So I thought, which taught me an awful lot about the publishing business right then and there. Anyway, so I got so much out of that. Like, I just felt, I hope everyone who's listening to this writes a novel at least once in their life. You don't have to do it to write because you want to sell the novel. It doesn't matter if nobody else reads it. Writing your first novel is like running your first marathon, right? You don't do it to win. You do it because it turns you into somebody who can run marathons, right?
Yeah.
You do it because it transforms you. And so writing that first novel transformed me. I'm sure I must have gained like 10 IQ points because I could think about bigger things.
Yeah.
Like I understood how to put them together. And it also helped me gain a certain kind of confidence that meant I started getting promotions for things I wasn't qualified for, when I went out into the sort of corporate world, because I just had that confidence. Like, I knew how to do something as big as writing an entire novel, like whatever the little corporate problem is with, change management of a database system, like none of that's going to be as hard as writing a novel. So it just kind of helped me in so many ways that I kind of thought that I wasn't going to end up necessarily writing another novel. Because like I say, I felt like I'd gotten all these benefits. So, but a few years later, there was a thing called the 3-day novel writing contest that comes up every year. It comes up, I think, in September, very early in September, end of August, where you have to try to write a novel in 3 days. Wow. And I was, I don't know, like literally on the last day you could register, I sort of went, okay, I'll do it. I had no plan. I didn't have an outline. You're allowed to bring outlines and notes into this process. And I didn't. Most people start at 12:01, like midnight, like on the dot. I got up at 7 a.m. Still didn't know what book I was going to write. But one of the things you discover is that after you've written your first novel, is that whether you want to or not, you're going to slowly be recharging a bunch of batteries and data banks in the back of your mind with bits of story. And so I ended up picking out of 3 possible stories. I picked this one story that was kind of weird swashbuckling things about these sort of disaffected swashbucklers. And over the course of those 3 days, I wrote 44,000 words, which is almost writing a book at the speed that I can type. So 44,000 words is about half the physical size of a regular novel you'll pick up on the store shelf these days. But almost close to the size of what a fantasy novel often used to be in the 70s and 80s. So yeah, I wrote 44,000 words. I slept better than I usually sleep. I slept 8 hours a night. I went for a long run. I had a music gig. I had to learn how to sing The Lady in Red at a wedding. And I came out with this manuscript that was originally called 3 of Traitors. And I was so happy about it. And it just kind of totally made the experience just made me happy. And a few years later, I was deciding what I wanted to do next in my career. And I thought, you know what, I'll pull that book out again. I rewrote it. It ballooned in size as my second drafts often do, became sort of 117,000 words. And then strangely enough, that book came to be called Traitor's Blade and it got me a 4-book deal and launched my career as an author.
Is that one of the ones on the shelves behind you?
It
Just out
is
of curiosity.
indeed. It's
Yeah.
at the top left-hand corner, Trader's Blade.
Brilliant. Wow, that's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Here, we can do a close-up shot like this. That's the British
Oh,
cover.
very cool. I like the cover. That is a very cool cover. So
The Germans designed that cover. Actually, we were floundering with cover designs, and a German publisher bought it. And in typical German fashion, before they'd even translated it, 2 weeks into the deal, they said this will be the cover. And
oh
we
wow.
looked at the cover and went, "That's great. We'll use that worldwide."
Yeah, so you had no choice in the publishing design at all for the cover or anything.
Oh no, I did. So my wonderful British publishers worked on a couple of very nice covers, but they were just a little conventional for that period of time. The typical sort of map, sort of looking background with a sword somewhere on it.
Yeah.
But the German cover was really striking,
Mm.
and so I said, can we use this? And they said yes. And so I've always been lucky with book covers, getting a chance to interfere in the design process. I used to be the head of a design program at Vancouver Film School. And so I do have some background in design, but mostly that just irritates proper designers,
Yeah.
when someone starts coming in and criticizing their kerning of their letters, which is kerning is just literally the gap between two individual letters. And so, someone going, I think you should, lower the kerning between the Q and the A. Q and A are two terrible letters to sit together. They always look like they're too far apart.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah. Wow, that's absolutely fantastic. And I can see, not let alone from the books behind you, but I can tell from your website and the rapier on your wall, that you've been influenced quite heavily by the fantasy genre. But what first attracted you to that genre?
When I was a teenager, that's what I started reading. A friend of mine from high school got me back into reading. I hadn't been reading for a long time, and he gave me a book by Stephen Bruce called Jareg, which is a great book, by the way. It's the Vlad Taltos series, that's the first of those books, is really, really fun, and he's a great writer. And that kind of got me on to a bunch of other books, and so I was reading a lot of fantasy. As a writer, I think what I like about fantasy is that if you're really drawn to theme as a writer, like if you're really interested in exploring human questions, why do, it can be anything. Why do people lie to each other? In a fantasy world, you can construct the physics to emphasize. I like that your cat's there. My cat will soon be by to make their presence known. In a fantasy novel, you can literally make the landscape or the physics reflect those themes. So for example, in the case of the Greatcoats, I kind of wanted to write about, I was writing about idealism in a sort of cynical world, and what place idealism has in a world where things haven't worked. So for example, in our own world, we have all these sort of ideals that we inherited from all of history, but especially through times like the 1960s, where you had all these, the Martin Luther Kings with "I have a dream" and things like that. And that often gets misapplied and misquoted by white people for their own benefits, I suppose. But there was a sort of a spirit of that, but that's sort of but if you look at the hippie spirit of pacifism and idealism, and we can all get along, we've often feel like those things have proven false, right? That it's clearly not true. So when you bring that up as a solution to any problem, when you have a huge conflict between two people, one of whom, one who feels they've been aggrieved by the other, usually both people feel they've been aggrieved, and you sort of suggest this, well, there's probably a way for us to get along and turn this to a positive. Very often people will dismiss that out of hand, like we so badly want justice these days in terms of like, just righting wrongs. And I understand why that is, but for me, I don't always see where it leads. So if I want to write about idealism, and especially swashbuckling idealism in the face of cynicism, I can do that in a historical novel, sort of, but then I'm bending history to my own needs. I can do it in a contemporary novel if I want to, but then I'm kind of bending society and characters and players within society to my needs. Like if I want to write a story about, I don't know, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in the United States, I'm going to basically be twisting their words or forcing things into them. Whereas if I'm writing in a fantasy world, I can construct a world where this is the case. So, where these themes are are kind of alive in tangible ways. And so in the case of the Greatcoats, which is my swashbuckling series, that's all about kind of swashbuckling and friendship and idealism. I sound like everything I write is very sort of pleasant and happy and, you know, tea drinking, as we might say. But in fact, they tend to be quite dark books. But in the case of the Greatcoats, it's set in a society that's horribly corrupt, where the king, the first decent king who'd come along in generations, has been beheaded, and the traveling magistrates, whose job was to kind of bring a sense of the law and decency and fairness to all the towns, you know, because that's how it used to work in the sort of in the Middle Ages. And in England, for example, they had the justices itinerant who had to go from town to town to town and hear cases. So these justices, who are called the Greatcoats in this world, have not only been kind of reviled by the dukes who killed the king and disbanded them, but they're even hated by all the people they tried to help, all the craftspeople and farmers, and who view them as sort of cowards and failures. And so for me, you know, if I can build that world that way, then I can kind of explore those themes. And I don't have to do it in a heavy-handed way, right? I think if I was doing that with a contemporary story or a historical story, I think the reader would sort of see the author putting their thumb on the scale all the time to try to get their polemical message across. But inside fantasy, you can set the rules of the world up first, and then you're able to kind of explore those themes without having to stick your thumb on the scale every time a character is about to say something.
Yeah, you can literally create a world to meet your needs and the way you see fit, and to get across the story, moral of the story or the plot, however is you see best. And I completely agree with you. I think there's a lot of scope yet to explore in the fantasy genre. There's a lot more that I think authors and writers and however people like to get published can explore and create. I think it's a huge area. And then you've got things like urban fantasy as well, which kind of potentially highlights modern contemporary worlds mixing in with fantasy world, and it's just extensive. So I completely agree with you on that one. My next question was the Way of the Argosy is your 11th novel. How do you keep coming up with so many different concepts and ideas?
Well, again, sort of for me, it partly gets back again to that sort of question of theme, where you have sort of these kind of things you want to explore. And often, by the way, you know, I talk about theme a lot, but the problem with talking about theme a lot is it sounds like someone's kind of stamping some kind of notion on a story before the story's written. Usually for an author, theme arises out of something else, because the writing process is this kind of funny illusion where an author thinks they're deciding what they're going to write, when in fact they're the ideas and the imagery we get mostly comes from our subconscious. And so what appeals to us is, you know, begins as, you know, in the case of the Greatcoats, is, you know, what would it be like if, you know, 3 former swashbuckling justices, you know, were stuck in this, you know, in this world where they're completely viewed as awful and everything they believed in is crap, and everybody believes in pragmatism now. But that, you know, but that's just my subconscious wrestling with other questions and then churning up ways to explore it, right? And so as a result, often if you are someone who writes in part because you're driven by those kinds of questions, it often takes a long time to answer those questions, and they often aren't answered in a single book. So each volume in the 4 Greatcoats books explores a different aspect of idealism. The first was idealism versus cynicism in Trader's Blade, and then when I was writing Night's Shadow, it's about idealism versus pragmatism. You know, the sort of, you know, the classic Machiavelli quote, right? The end justifies the means. Well, if you believe in any kind of idealism, you don't think the end justifies the means. But if you live in the world that we live in, or the world that the Greatcoats stories take place in, it often seems like that works. You know, the end justifies the means works, and certainly it's what we all turn to. You know, so And then in Saint's Blood, it became the idealism versus faith. And often I see lots of people, I meet lots of people whose ideals, if they're people of faith, whose ideals are sometimes at odds with their faith. And they have to navigate that. And so I wanted to kind of explore some of that there. And in the final book, in Tyrant's Throne, it was about the ideal of the law versus the ideal of justice, right?
Yeah.
And we almost all of us say, well, justice is more important than the law. The law is a bunch of rules written in a book. But in fact, justice is entirely subjective. What is just for you is probably not just for me.
Yeah.
And the laws are, in a better world than we live in, meant to be objective, meant to be universally applied. And so I wanted to sort of explore that tension, again, with lots of sword fights. So that's just one thing, right? That's just one impulse, is idealism. And it takes me, 4 books to kind of even scratch the surface of that. So I think that's one of the beauties about writing fantasy, is that as long as you have something to say as an author, other than I want to write about swords and dragons and elves and whatever else. Like as long as what you want to say is something that is not just about the surface tropes of fantasy, then fantasy as a genre will give you so many ways to explore it that you don't tend to lack for ideas.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. And I can see just from reading The Way of the Argosy, you've really thought about the philosophy side of the Argosy culture, as well as the thief culture. And I thought I really like your style of writing, because you really go into depth about the thinking processes of different people, where they're from, and it was just absolutely fascinating to read. And it's quite fresh to me. I've not read writing a book with a writing style quite as like yours, so thank you very much for that. It's absolutely fantastic, and that is why, because I'm so attracted to that trip, making me think about the book, and making me think about life and questioning, what is the answer to the world and the universe. It's really interesting, so that's why I'm gonna be reading the whole series and then looking into the rest of the other works that you have done. Because I'd like to get to know more about your perspective on things in general, and in philosophy in itself. But going back.
Sorry, just one thing I want to say about that, which is, it's funny. It's very difficult to actually discern an author's own perspective from a novel, and which isn't to say people don't get it right all the time. But I remember when I wrote Saint's Blood, and because it deals with sort of a false god, and because one of the principles it deals with is this notion that's in the book of the first god came after the first prayer. In other words, that we sort of make the gods in a way, right? And I remember thinking, oh, this is going to just irritate religious people really badly, and I'm not religious myself. And so one of the principles when you're an author has to be, you shouldn't try to hurt anybody with your writing. That's you can have all kinds of anything you want in your writing. You can write about whatever you want, but you should make every effort not to hurt groups with your writing, which we all fail at all the time, but we at least have to try. And I remember talking to my editor, and I said, is this going to really make Christians upset? And because the whole notion in that story is, a one true God seems to rise up, to dismiss all the false gods, which looks which can, if you're from a Christian tradition, can look like, except it turns out that God is a deception. It can look like you're saying, oh, you're clearly referring to Christianity supplanting the pagan religions, and you're one of these lefty pinko Wiccan whatevers. And anyway, my editor, who's the inimitable Joe Fletcher, who worked with kind of all these great authors and has been around forever, said, well, I'm a Christian and it doesn't bother me, so you're fine. And I thought, okay, well, that's good. Hopefully I won't get too many knocks. And I remember, and I got an email not long after the book came out from a very pretty kind of right wing, I think, Christian guy who said, you know, thank you so much for writing this book. I see from reading your book that, you know, you are a Christian man like myself, and you understand that we must dismiss the false gods, you know, and you know, and I think in his mind, in that person's mind, the one false god represented here was probably like somebody else's monotheistic god, right?
Okay.
Because even among
That's
Christians, there's like,
interesting.
even among, you know, Protestants think that Catholics, you know, worship, you know, the golden calf, but in their own form. So I really, yeah, and that comes up a lot. I sometimes, even with the gray coats, I mean, I'm Canadian, I'm left of Stalin, you know, like you know, we're, you know what I mean, like a default Canadian is a you know, there's a wide range of views in Canada. I should never say a default Canadian, but on balance, we tend to vote in fairly liberal, sort of left of center governments. But because I write about swashbuckling and heroic daring and all that kind of stuff, I often get people who are very politically right wing who will
Wow.
write and say, oh, you know, I really love these books. I get people who are very politically left wing writing and saying, I love these books. And so I sometimes think, oh, I wish I could just kind of put these two people together and
Yeah.
see what it is they're seeing, because,
Yeah.
you know, and that's the beauty of it, right? You know, books are created by authors, but stories are created by readers.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
we put, you know, we just put down this text on the page, and then that the reader's mind takes it and creates something entirely new from it. Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry, that was an aside, but I just wanted to mention that.
No, I completely agree, and that's why there are stories like Lord of the Rings that have done so well, because Tolkien initially wrote it as something because he was, you know, needing to do that, but then all the Tolkien fans in the world just took it to another level and made something amazing out of his work. So I completely understand where you're coming from there. But going back to the book of the way of I can't get my words out today. I do apologize. The
That's
way of
okay.
the Argosy. Do you relate to any of the characters from the book?
I mean, I sort of relate to all the characters in all my books in one way or another. Usually, when a character does something awful, it's definitely a thought that I've had. You know, and usually when a character does something wonderful, it's usually a thing I wish I had done in a similar situation. Um, I try to write from even the word humanism gets problematic lately, because sometimes people throw up humanism as if it's the opposite of feminism or something. So someone will say I'm a feminist, and someone else will say, well, I'm a humanist. And like, that's not what humanism means. Feminism is absolutely a logical offshoot of or development progression of humanism. But I try to. So when I say I write from a humanist perspective, I guess I mean I try to write about the things that I can relate to, because humans have them in common. So I have no idea what it would be like to be a refugee of a society that was completely obliterated by another society. But I know exactly what it feels like to feel lonely, and I know what it feels like to feel scared, and I know what it feels like to feel despondent. I know what it feels like to feel angry, or I know what it feels like to feel happy, or to feel free. Like, so all of those things I can write about. And so when I'm writing characters, I relate to them through that mechanism of emotions that we have in common, right?
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean and again, doesn't mean I experience anything like them. It doesn't mean I would make the same decisions as them. It just means that I understand what it feels like to be, you know, you know, I don't know what it's like to be you know, to be a trans woman, especially in a time, you know, in kind of such wildly altering times as we have now. But I know what it's like to be in love. And, you know, when I meet trans people and they talk about being in love, you know, there's commonality there. And so, yeah, in that sense, I relate to all the characters. Often, as I say, I think often my heroic characters are braver than I am, and more daring, which I suppose is why I so adore. One of the Argosi have their 4 ways, but they also have what are called the 7 talents, and those are the skills that they develop to sort of survive as wandering travelers in a dangerous world. And you know, some of them are things that make a lot of sense to us, like arta erez, which is the art of defense, which is sort of like their kind of notion of martial arts, which is
Yeah.
unique to every person's body. So something like that makes a lot of sense to us as a skill you develop. But one of their skills, which is my favorite to write about. Sorry, my cat was bugging me. So there
Oh,
she's.
oh, we both got black cats. I love
Yes, she had to get in on the picture.
that.
But one of the Argosy talents I like writing about the most is called art of alar, which is daring, or as Farius and Durrell call it, swagger.
Yeah.
And so, because I often love that moment where someone is just in a terrible situation and they just kind of swagger right into it,
Yeah.
sort of fearlessly. So I always wish I had more art of alar myself, and so I suppose that's why I write about it.
Oh, that's fantastic. I also noticed that while reading, you do write in a very provocative way, first person. But would you say you've been inspired by any one or person or a group of people in any particular way? Do you think you've been influenced to write in this style?
Yeah, I think that when I think of sort of a first person narrative voice, probably the three that influenced me the most would be Roger Zelazny, who was kind of very classic writer. He wrote Nine Princes in Amber. The first half of that book I still think is just totally wonderful. And it's kind of got that noir vibe to it, which
Yeah.
harkens back to Raymond Chandler, who wrote the character Philip Marlowe, in The Big Sleep,
Yeah.
played ably by Humphrey Bogart in the movie version. The noir stylists, just to me, I love the way they write first person. Every observation, like a noir writer will never say the wall was pale blue, right? The noir writer will say the wall was the pale blue of broken dreams and a drowned corpse.
Yeah.
Like everything is sort of tinged with that,
Yeah.
with that opinion. So I quite love that. And Stephen Bruce, who I mentioned before, who wrote Jarrig, I think just had a wonderful sort of first person voice. He was the first fantasy author that made me realize you didn't have to write with sort of these and thous all the time, that you could write in a very contemporary voice. And so I try to do some of that. I try to balance it out as carefully as I can, so it's never distracting. But that sort of style and voice is really important to me. And yeah, and first person, has its disadvantages. You can only see the story from one person's perspective. Whereas third person, when you're writing, she walked into the room and she picked up the cup. You have way more flexibility with narrative distance, for example. Like I can't, if you write first person and you write, I walked into the room, I picked up the cup, I threw the cup at the wall. For the most part, the reader's going to go, what the hell's going on? Because if you don't know what's the thinking behind someone's actions, when it's that intimate, you feel that the author is separating you from the character, that they're putting a wall up, right? Whereas when you're in third person, you can leave some of those things more ambiguous. You can do this. She walked in the room, she picked up the cup, she threw it at the wall, and you can intentionally say to the reader, now my cat's decided to get attention by playing with a spare pair of headphones. You can intentionally say to the reader, you don't know exactly what she's thinking in this moment, and that's okay. So first person's great for that kind of intimacy. It's challenging because it doesn't give you that, and that sort of ability to play with distance quite as much. And of course, third person allows you to deal with the viewpoints of multiple characters, which is one of the reasons why Way the Argosy got written, is because so many readers and me as a writer wanted to know more about what it was like to be Farius, right? Because in Spellsinger is all about Kellen, who's a young man who's part of a very magical society. He's from the Gentep. His parents are noted mages. His younger sister is sort of the most talented young mage of their entire generation. And all he's ever wanted to do is sort of be a mage himself, and his powers start to fade away as he's coming up to his trials. And so he's suddenly faced with what am I going to do? If I can't be this thing I've always wanted to be, and I've always believed was integral to who I am, then what happens? And that's when he meets Farius Parfax, who of course, has very little admiration for magic or mages. So So, you know, we see that whole series unfolding through Kellen's eyes, but a lot of people and myself kind of wanted to see something through Farius's eyes. And so that's why I had to write Way of the Argosy.
Yeah. And when reading it, even though I haven't yet read the rest of the series, it's technically, like you said earlier, it can be read any way that the reader wishes. But I guess if you're thinking from a chronological standpoint, it's a prequel to Spellslinger. But what inspired you to create the prequel, if you like? Did you want to? Was it because you wanted to lay the background down for the readers?
No, in fact, although that would be a perfectly good reason to do it. I have never wanted to write a prequel in my life. I don't like reading prequels. And so for me, it's not a prequel, which is strange. I mean, but except that, you know, because to me, a prequel is a story about a set of elements on which the later books are dependent.
Yeah.
And the later books aren't dependent on Way of the Argosy. Way of the Argosy is just about writing about another person's life and the challenges that they sort of faced and the way that they overcame them. And so chronologically, it takes place before Spellslinger. It's certainly a perfectly fine place to start, especially also because I think, you know, people have so many reading choices. That if you're someone who sort of goes, you know what, I've read a whole bunch of books from, you know, YA fantasy novels from a male perspective, or male character's perspective, rather. They're all sort of from a male perspective because they're all written by me. But I want to read a character that, you know, that centers a female protagonist. Then you might go, you know what, I'm going to read Way of the Argosy first. If you've just come off of reading like 42 Cassandra Clare novels or something like that, or actually, I shouldn't say that because maybe she has male protagonists too. I don't know. But if you just read a whole bunch of books with a certain type of protagonist and you're like, I want to read something a little different, I want to read about a whiny 16-year-old boy that's my favorite kind of person in the whole world, then you jump into Spellslinger.
That's fantastic. And I can see, because I've looked on your website and I've looked at your work as a whole, you've won quite a few awards over the years, as well as being nominated for the Carnegie Medal. What was that like? That must have felt like an achievement.
Well, actually, so I should qualify. I've probably won like 3 awards. I've been nominated for like a dozen awards. I'm you know, always a bridesmaid, never a bride. But it's fine because getting nominated is sort of the best part, to be honest. And I'm, you know, look, there's 4 parts to being a novelist, right? There's the part of you that's a human being, right? Who just needs, you know, food, shelter, you know, love, health, all those things, right? There's the part of you that's an artist that just needs to create stuff, that just needs to find important or find some kind of things that feel truthful to you to say to the world. There's a part of you that has to be an author, which is an author is almost like a brand. You know, when I was first published, my authors looked at my bio and they went, "Oh, you once worked with swords. All right, you're the sword guy." And I was like, "Oh my God, like, no, I've done all these other things and I'm not really doing I don't do a lot of fencing anymore." And they're like, "Doesn't matter." I'm like, but like almost every fantasy novelist at some point either fenced or swung swords or wanted to. So we're all sword people, I guess. But the author sort of level is sort of the brand, right, in a way. And then there's the business person, right, which is the you know, the person who has to figure out how the money coming in has to be you know, enough to fulfill all your needs and make smart contract decisions and things like that. So that's 4 part of you, right? A human being, an artist, a sort of a brand or an author, and a business. And all of that works great so long as you never let the element of one drift into the wrong category. So, you know, an author who gets nominated for an award, that's great, right? Because people think you're more important, right? And so you're like, oh, this is good. This is good for me being an author. If you let that being nominated for an award drift into your human part, right, into the part of you that needs to think about being healthy and finding love and you know, then it starts to mess up your sense of yourself, right? And so I tend to so when I get nominated for an award, I think the first thing I do is I mention it to my publishers and then go, hey, so this is a good reason to spend some more money on marketing. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's a sort of a tool. Or I'll go, yeah, I did this a couple of times. I got nominated for an award. I emailed one of my publishers and I said, hey, here's some really great news. Look at that. We just got nominated for this great award. By the way, there's a convention coming up next month. I was wondering if you guys would front like $500 to cover the plane tickets.
Nice.
So yeah, hopefully none of my publishers are watching this. Although I'm not really as clever as I'm trying to, as I try to tell myself. So I'm sure they figured this out long ago. But that's kind of the function of awards. Awards almost never go, you know, if you just stand in front of a bookshelf, a fantasy bookshelf in any bookstore, and then you think, oh, one of these got nominated for something, and all these others didn't, you immediately have the sense of, well, that's just ridiculous, right? That,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
what makes this and the Carnegie thing in particular, I mean, I was delighted when I heard about it, but to be nominated, I think you mostly need a member librarian or something from that association to put in the nomination, and then you go to so you end up on like a long list, and then there's like 2 short lists, and I'm pretty sure I got eliminated by the first short list, no problem, like I was already gone. So yeah, so it was lovely. But I've been nominated for things for the strangest and worst reasons possible. I was nominated for what was used to be called, I think, the Campbell Award, which is now called, I think, the Astounding Award, which is part of the Hugos. So if you're a fantasy author, the Hugo is where you want to be, and the Outstanding Award, boy, you know, as a first-time author, that's what you want. The thing is I got nominated because like 2 different kind of pretty ultra right-wing groups put me on their list.
Wow.
And it's probably not fair. They would probably not feel it was fair to call them ultra right-wing groups, but there was a big controversy a few years ago of a group of writers and readers in fantasy and science fiction who felt like what they would think of as good old-fashioned storytelling was getting shut out from the Hugos by these blocks of people who would only vote for, you know, diverse and what they would see as politically correct groups. Of course, for everybody else, it was just a function that there's just more and new and more, you know, more interesting books getting written, and everybody's read those good old-fashioned style fantasy novels. And so there was a big war, and so there was, you know, there were quite a conflict. And these sad puppies and rabid puppies, as they called themselves, would put these lists together, and I have no idea why, but my name ended up on both those lists, which meant I ended up being shortlisted for the award, which meant a very awkward trip to the Hugos, because the Hugos is very much a more, I think, politically left-wing organization.
Really?
And so anytime somebody saw me on a panel or at first or recognized my name tag, their first thought was, oh my God, it's one of those sad puppy guys who hates us and wants to kill us all.
Oh no.
But fortunately, they were everyone at the Hugos was absolutely wonderful to me. Like at Worldcon, they were just completely delightful, and you know, and very open-minded. And so, you know, so it was actually, it was great, but it was a very awkward experience. So that's a very long way of saying, you know, awards are wonderful. I would love to win many, many more of them, but they're not a reflection. It's not a pure meritocracy. And in fact, really nothing is a pure meritocracy. So sometimes it's because you did something really great, and sometimes it's because you're really lucky, and sometimes it's because people thought that you would be hated more than someone else, and they want to stick their, you know, thumb in somebody else's eye.
Not without their complexities then.
No. It's nice because I get to tell my wife, and then my wife smiles, and we have an excuse to, you know, go out for dinner.
Oh, of course.
That's the best
part. You don't need an excuse for that, right? Oh, fantastic. Well, that sounds really intriguing. And I've never met anybody who's been nominated or who's won an award. So that's a really interesting insight. And I'm sure our viewers will love to know more about that. And maybe they'll be following you more and looking at your website, because you've got more information about what type of awards that you've won on your website. Speaking of, you have a beautiful website, and you've got 3 books due out later on this year. Am I correct in saying that?
You would have been correct, but in publishing, everything shifts all the time. Yeah. I have a book coming out this year, which is called Fall of the Argosy, which is the follow-up to Way of the Argosy.
Brilliant.
Yeah, which is and I love that book. It's in copy edits right now, and I was amazed at how it turned out. I was so happy because honestly, sometimes writing after your first few books, writing sometimes is a crapshoot. You just like you'll be slogging something out for like 8 months and go, oh my god, I just wrote 100,000 words of something that doesn't work. I have to go back to the beginning. Or sometimes you write nonstop in a kind of a frenzy for a month, and you're like, oh my god, like this book needs work, but I can't believe I found something that's worth saying, that's worth putting out there. So Fall of the Argosy is one of those books for me where I was super happy with how it turned out, and it's got zombies in it, so you really
Wow.
can't go wrong with
Spoiler.
sort of a plague spread by verses, by words, which is very suited to my way of thinking. So that book comes out then, and then next year, it's been pushed to next year, is going to be the first in the Court of Shadows series, which is the follow-up series to the Greatcoats, although you don't need to have read the Greatcoats to be in there. And the first one was going to be Play of Shadows, which is what I like to call the finest swashbuckling adventure ever set in a theater, which is also a huge marketing problem, because who the hell is out there looking for swashbuckling novels set in theaters? But the one that's likely to come out first is called Our Lady of Blades, which is set primarily in a dueling court. So that's a little bit more mainstream for fantasy readers. So yeah, and I have a bunch of short stories coming out on my website. There's The Fox and the Bowman is up there right now.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole bunch of other ones that are coming up, and they're I'm trying this thing of letting people get stories directly from an author rather than through other people. Have tried this, I've done this before and probably do it better than me, but I've noticed more and more kind of readers want to be able to get something directly from an author rather than through Kobo or Amazon or whoever else.
Yeah. Well, how do you find the time? Because obviously that's a lot of work that you're releasing each year. How do you schedule your time well enough to be able to get so much out?
Well, I'm a full-time writer, so that helps a lot. I was really lucky that my first 4-book deal, I always measure my writing income in terms of job categories. So my first series allowed me what I call the barista level of success, which is basically if I just wrote 1 book a year, I would earn roughly as much as a barista, at considerably less effort than a barista spends. And then my next level was to get up to dental hygienist, and then plumber, and then accountant. So I've been getting close to chartered accountant level of author success for a little while now, and so that means that I'm able to just write full time, which is a massive privilege. Although it doesn't remotely translate into the level of productivity that it should. So I'm naturally a pretty fast writer, but if you think of how long it takes you, if any of your viewers sort of sit down and just start writing a story, just anything, you don't have to finish it, you just start writing, but start writing for an hour and just don't let your fingers come off the keyboard, right? You'll probably get somewhere about, let's say, 500 words, maybe 1,000 words, maybe, sometimes I've written 2,000 words in an hour. So if you imagine that you're working 40 hours a week, and let's say you were only writing 500 words, right? That would be what, 20,000 words a week? Is that right? No, 40 times 500. Yeah. That would be 20,000 words a week. There's 52 weeks in a year. So that would be a million words a year. That would be 10 novels, right?
That's a good amount. Yeah. Especially,
So now work that way back and go, I write about 300,000 good words a year. And you sort of go, wow, that guy's not working nearly as hard as he should. So the difference, where the time difference comes in is, and by the way, there are some writers who are writing 1 million words a year. And not just now with the sort of self-published, wave where you'll get these people who are just like cranking them out like machines. But Earl Stanley Gardner, one of the,
Okay.
the best-selling author of the 20th century, who almost nobody knows anymore. He wrote the Perry Mason books, which became a famous TV series that
Yeah.
almost nobody remembers, except that they did a remake recently.
Mm.
That seems to have nothing to do with Earl Stanley Gardner's books. But he used to write 1.2 million words a year. He had to move to a compound out in, I think, New Mexico or Texas, where he had a staff of 8 whose jobs were just to sit around transcribing his dictaphone recordings.
Wow.
But that's how fast this guy was writing. And he
That's
was
amazing.
obsessed. Earl Stanley Gardner was obsessed with getting better as a writer too. Like, what's interesting about him is it wasn't just he cranked out all these huge hits, but he was constantly questioning what he was doing, and did it have literary merit, and how could he become a better writer. And so he was always in search of both kind of literary greatness and sort of formulas to create new mysteries. He had these giant lists of reasons someone would kill someone else, and ways someone could kill someone else, and where places you could find a body. And he'd have to like tick these things off, because otherwise, he'd risk writing the same story over again. So productivity wise, there have always been vastly more productive people than me. But I think, it works out. But one of the struggles is, remember I said there's 4 parts to being a novelist. The human, the artist, the author, and the business person, is that there's a lot of those other things to do. So there's a certain amount of publicity that you do, having being on an interview, which is great fun for me. But it's not, strictly speaking, writing the next chapter in a novel. One day I'll try to do that. Actually, that would be really fun. Is I'll do an interview while I'm trying to write a chapter in a novel.
Wow, that would be.
see, I'm sure I'll never be invited back after that. But there's also sort of marketing stuff, and then there's when you finished a draft of a novel, like let's say when you get to the final draft, and it's like you're like, okay, this is the best version of the story I can write. It then has to go to your editor, who may come back with developmental things like, I don't think you developed this character enough, or I hate this character, or I hate that character, or why didn't you let them kiss? These days it's always, why didn't you let them kiss? And then from there it has to go to a copy editor or line editor, who's helps find all the ways that you've repeated the same word 42 times in 6 paragraphs, which I'm really prone to. So I'm always so grateful for the copy edit. And even after that, you then have to go to the proofs. They actually lay the book out in a PDF format, and then you have to go through and find the last mistakes. And I have some hilariously marked up proofs from books where I've inserted entire chapters into the proofs, which you're absolutely not allowed to do. Like, I've changed the story, because the instinct is to sort of fiddle with stuff. So when you look at it that way, so when I'm telling you all this as if I'm sort of providing information, although I'm sure you already know all of it. But I'm probably doing it in part so that I can feel better about the fact that I put out 3 books a year and not 30 books a year. So I'm justifying myself more than anything else. So yes.
Well, quite a few of the readers who will be watching this and they'll probably be writing their own work as well. So it's this interview today is more inspiration for them to be able to think, right, that's a really good goal to try and achieve, and they know where the top writers are achieving, and they know what potentially their limit would be, and if they can sort of map it out in such a way. I think you've given a really solid framework for a budding writer to move on to, which it was my bonus question. For budding writers, what's the best advice that you can give them?
So I put a lot of thought into this when you first told me about this question, and I take it very, very seriously, because my biggest fear about writing and about giving writing advice, or my biggest fear when I look out at the world of people who want to be writers, is that the people who have been taught from a young age to believe that everything they do is awesome and that they should take risks are going to end up writing a novel, whether they have something amazing to say or not. I happen to believe everybody has something to say, and I happen to believe everybody has a good novel in them. Doesn't mean it's going to sell to anybody, but I think it's worth writing. But if you've been taught your whole life through school or through the sort of the I don't want to, I hate when I use the word patriarchy because it makes it sound like I know something, like I know what I'm talking about. But when I was a little boy in school, as a little boy, I was taught by my teachers that everything I did was great and should be celebrated, and that I should take lots of risks. And the girls in my class were taught that they should be not make any trouble and be quiet and be supportive of other people.
Right.
My biggest fear is that people who have learned to be quiet and not make trouble and be supportive of other people will end up kind of getting ignored and not being willing to take the risk of writing. And so the advice that I think is the most important that I have to offer people these days is figure out how to be good to yourself, to be kind to yourself as you write, right? You're not going to suffer from a lack of criticism, right, in the world. No writer, I rarely meet the writer who is unable to critique their own work, right? Sometimes, people can hardly talk to me about their book without apologizing for it, right? But the reality is that you don't know as you're writing your first book how great you might be at certain things, right? All you ever hear about, and it's what kind of bugs me about a lot of writing advice, is people's, everyone has like 37 don'ts, right?
Yeah.
Give us your top don't. I was on a panel once where they said, where they asked us the final question, and most of these people were not particularly great or accomplished writers from what I'd seen, nor was I. But the question was, what are your top 3 don'ts for would-be writers? And I was like, I got so kind of pissed off that my answer then, which I suppose is my answer now, is if you have to give someone a don't, it's don't assume that because it's your first time that there isn't going to be something amazing in your writing, right? There will be lots of things that are terrible. It's actually not that hard to fix terrible things, right? Bad dialogue, bad prose, What's hard is to find wonderful things.
Yeah.
And my first book, which I mentioned at the top of this interview, the wonderfully named, but regrettably poorly executed Skeletons in the Cloister, that was the first serious thing I ever wrote. There's lots of stuff to pick at and to find terrible in that book, but there are some moments in there that I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe how good this is.
Yeah.
There's like a scene with an old monk who's been this bitter guy the whole way through the story, and you just assumed he was kind of nuts and off his rocker, where he like suddenly separates his cane, and it turns out he's had a cane sword all the time, and he's about to die fighting off the killer who's coming back to kill someone else, and it's this moment of sublime stupid bravery, and I'm like, holy crap, that was wonderful. And that's what you should aim for when you're writing your first novel. You don't have to try to be perfect. You don't have to dwell on all the stuff that's going to be bad. Just let yourself find the stuff that is uniquely you and will be wonderful. Because then once you go, holy crap, I wrote a great scene with a weird old monk who pulls out his cane sword and dies in a glorious last fight. You go, it turns out I'm really good at that.
Yeah.
So maybe my next novel will be about a bunch of swashbucklers fighting the good fight for what may be the last time, right?
Oh wow, okay. That's a really interesting way to see how you've recognized your own development. That's really quite inspirational. I hope I'm sure our viewers rather will take that to heart, because that's quite important. Not everything you write will be amazing, but there will probably be some gems in there. And it's the same with every self-published author and every mainstream author. There are gems in most books that I've read. There are moments of brilliance. you know, so thank you very much for that. That was fantastic. But my last question for you was, we've discussed a little bit about the books on a wider general scale. What's next for you?
So I'm just about to go into the final draft of Our Lady of Blades, which is the book I mentioned that's coming out next year, which is a very challenging book for me because it's playing with narrative voice in a way that I've never done before. So it's got first person present tense. It's got, in the present narrative, it has first person past tense in the secondary narrative, and it has the occasional third person chapter, which I'm sure for anybody that reads and thinks about point of view is probably getting hives right now. And yet it's necessary for the story. So it's a complicated and challenging story for me to write, which is going to be kind of interesting. I've also just finished a bunch of short stories set in both the Great Coats world and the Spellslinger world, which I'm going to be making available to readers for like 99 cents or something on my website. And I have I'm in the midst of negotiating another book deal. So there's just a lot of that sort of stuff going on. This is a really weird time to be an author in a lot of ways. Publishing is when I first got into publishing, everyone was saying like, oh, you can't get good advances and the heydays are gone and all. And then I was like, oh, but my contracts are great. Like they're pretty good anyway. But I'm in that phase now where I'm constantly being asked to pitch a new series and being told, we love your writing. We just want a new series from you. And I'll start pitching the series and an editor will say, this is wonderful. I love it. And then they'll go to an acquisitions meeting, which is how books get bought. I don't know if your viewers know about acquisitions meetings or not, but they're the absolute worst thing ever invented by human beings. I shouldn't say that. It's probably someone who's on an acquisitions team is going to see that. But it used to be that an editor saw your book and said, I think I can make this great. I think we can make money off it, and would buy it. Now they go to an acquisitions meeting, which has sort of representatives of all the different sort of teams that are in publishing, where an editor desperately tries in a very short amount of time to pitch the book to that whole team. And all it takes is, a 20-year-old intern bringing coffee to go, oh, that's so passe, as they're walking out the door, and all of a sudden everybody panics. So I deal with a lot of that lately, which is kind of amusing. But hopefully won't last forever. So it's a weird time to be an author. I'm constantly, and I don't, again, this is something that might be helpful for starting authors. I've done pretty well, but I still will pitch a series that I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever, and it'll come back from 9 out of 10 publishers with like, no, that's just it's not even like, no, we hate that. It's just like, I don't think so. Right. Yeah. And then one will be like, oh, this is really fantastic. Right. And we'll buy it. And so, as an author, as a person, I tend to think, well, again, if I look at it as a human, which is the worst way to look at it, I go, well, surely if 8 out of 10 publishers wanted to buy it, that would mean it was a better book than if only 1 out of 10 wants to buy it, right? But as a business person, you have to understand that those publishers are driven by all kinds of different forces and decisions and stuff like that. And you have to constantly remind yourself that the Beatles, were turned down by every single record label except Decca. And so, that's what it is for all of us. Because I know when people are trying to get an agent, that can be the most depressing time in the world, right? Because it just feels like you're constantly getting turned on. I got turned down by tons of agents. I think when I was first starting out, I sent off my query to 12 agents with Trader's Blade, right? With that book. And I got nothing but form. I didn't even get nice rejections. I just got form rejections back. And then I managed to find my agent, who is, thank heavens, she was the most wonderful agent on the planet. I adored working with her. She's now had the temerity to go off to do a master's degree at Oxford. God, of all the ingratitude, I tell you. But my new agent's wonderful too, but I shouldn't say that publicly because I try to criticize them as much as I can in public. I, you know, it was one agent, right? It was just one that picked it. And then the funny thing is when I was at the World Fantasy Convention in Toronto, I think, and when I was signing the deal for the 4-book deal, and publishers and editors always want to take you to parties, or they did back when you could still have parties. And I remember I was introduced to the head of a pretty big agency, literary agency, who said, "Oh, you know, oh really? I want to talk to you." And my editor sort of pushed them away and said, "No, he's already got an agent." And this person was like, "Oh no, it's about something else." But Joe Fletcher was protecting me as one of her doves, which is how she views authors. And as we walked away, I said, "Would it be okay if I go back and tell her that I actually queried her agency and they never even bothered getting back to me?"
Burn, yeah.
Joe said, "No, you must not do that." And actually, that person, by the way, is lovely, and a very good agency. But I wasn't the right fit for them at that moment, right? And that's what we're all dealing with all the time. And so it means that's one of the strangest things. A rejection means virtually nothing. An acceptance means everything.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
A rejection doesn't mean you're bad. An acceptance means you're probably great.
Wow.
Right? That's the weird part of it. And so, yeah, it can be a hard slog for people. But I tell you, it is for all of us. I swear at some point, Stephen King's going to make the mistake of sending a proposal to a publisher who's going to then turn it down.
So that's quite interesting. I mean, I know that, well, I've heard of many agents and publishers. They get thousands of manuscripts in on a regular basis. It must be really hard from their point of view to be able to quickly scan through, because they don't have the leisure of just going into depth with the book, and they must quickly scan it to see whether this would be worth their time. But from your perspective, it sounds you've taken it on a more healthy sort of viewpoint, where that's okay, and that's amazing, and that's another inspirational thing that you've been able to express today. So thank you so much.
I'm laughing because if my wife could come in at the end of these interviews, she would shoo me out of the room and say, "Okay, here's what he really says all day long." Right? Yeah. Here's how many times, because my publishers are British, my world rights publishers are generally in the UK and I'm in Canada, so we're 8 hours behind. The first thing I see in the morning is emails from my publishers and my agents and stuff, and so my wife would say, every morning he complains about some new thing and how they told him they love the book and then they reject, and then they didn't want to make an offer on it. And so that's the difference between the human and the author. So I guess I say that because I want to say, look, it's okay to feel like crap when you get a rejection. It's totally natural, and it happens to all of us, even when you are at a stage where, like, I'm completely happy with the level of success I've had. If I just had that for the rest of my life, I'd be delighted. I'd like to be, I'd like to own a castle, but whatever. I have a nice house and I'm happy, and two cats, and I get to travel as much as I want when there isn't a pandemic going on. So but even in those situations, you can constantly be like feeling rejection and feeling like disheartened and things like that. The trick is just, again, for your viewers who and listeners who want to pursue this, the trick is you have to remember that rejection is being felt by the human side of you, but there's still a business side of you that has to kind of focus, and that business side of you is the part that has to remember all the things we just said, right? They reject it for all kinds of reasons. They often won't get past a sentence that ends in a preposition. Like every stupid reason in the world, will reject a manuscript, which is why it means nothing. It means very little when it's rejected and means a great deal when it's accepted. So in terms of very practical advice, it used to be that an editor would read a book to search for the story. And if they didn't find the story, they would a great story, they would reject it. Now, because as you say, they've got thousands and thousands of these things to deal with. They look it is the most human thing in the world that the first thing they do is look for a reason to reject it. My other cat is desperate to make an appearance before the it's all done.
Beautiful.
But so it's natural. So that means that if your first 3 chapters aren't pretty much prose perfect, they're likely to get rejected. Not entirely, but you have to just do a really great job on the first 3 chapters, to the point where I was talking to a big New York editor recently. And this guy's had some huge hits, and he's a really, really nice guy. And he was saying, you know what, I've stopped. I let somebody else kind of deal with those first 3 chapters because I've discovered that everyone has figured out how to make 3 great opening chapters.
Yeah.
Like that's just the bar now to just be to be looked at. And what he looks at is the second act. Okay. Like what happens when you have to start fulfilling the promise of the premise. Right. What the Save the Cat people call fun and games, right? That second act, like all the things, all the moments you see in a movie trailer, like when they actually have to enter the story.
Yeah.
So you have to sort of perfect all those things. And that's challenging. But that will get you past a lot of the problems. I remember I asked, sorry, I know I'm going kind of long here, but when my first editor at Penguin back when it was Penguin, becoming Penguin Random House, she would go to a thing called the Surrey Writers Festival, which is a pretty big writers festival in Canada. It's not Surrey in England. And I said, isn't that just like a huge waste of your time when you go to these things where you go to these pitch sessions where people pitch you their books, and don't you just like, I just imagined that it was kind of embarrassing all around. And she said, no, like sometimes you find somebody really good, and she said, like 90, when we talk about the thousands of manuscripts on the slush pile, remember that 90% of those are incoherent right off the top. Like it's a query letter that is filled with spelling mistakes that nobody bothered. Like if you want to write a query letter, there's a lot of templates out there to find to do it sort of professionally. The hard thing is to make it personal, right? And it's all the things you hear, like figure out the name of the actual agent you're pitching to. Don't put dear agent, don't put dear editor, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of those manuscripts are crap right on page 1. And a lot of those query letters are crap on page 1. They open with, I am the greatest undiscovered author in the world, and you'd be lucky to have me as a client.
Yeah, that doesn't resound so well, does it?
Not unless you, by the way, I'm not sure that that's the worst crime. The worst crime is just if your page 1 is boring. Yeah. So, but again, again, that's that problem. Like, these are author problems, right? The right query letter and the right first page and all that stuff. The artistic problem is the one that most of us have to deal with when we're starting out, which is, how do I find the artistic voice inside me, right? Like, how do I, somewhere in you, if you want to write, somewhere in you is a really good writing voice and really good ideas and really good story. So your job is to find that. And so that's what you got to do. And that's why, and whatever method gets you there, that's why I'm not very prescriptive about outlining or not outlining, or I find most conversations about craft almost seem to me like someone's tried to invent a language that doesn't reflect anything underneath it. It's what's that old quote, like I'm paraphrasing horribly, but like talking about writing is like dancing about architecture.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah. I don't know exactly, but yeah,
I think the original quote was talking about jazz is like dancing about architecture or something. But the point being that all of that stuff is very surface, and the stuff that you have to unlock is all inside you, and so whatever method lets you unlock that. And usually, not always, but for me, the best way is find something that troubles me, that I feel deep about, and then start writing on the page, and know that what I'm writing on the page is not necessarily the book. It's the quest for the book.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
anyway, sorry, I'm waxing polemical here. So
Oh no, not at all. That's absolutely fine. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been absolutely a pleasure to talk to you and to have this interview with you. And thank you very much for giving me your time. And as I say, I will be investing as much money as it takes to get the rest of the series, because it's such an in-depth creation, and I love books that make me think about the concepts that you're using in the world building. I love world building. I think, you can't go overboard, because worlds should be complicated and they should have lots of little nuances in. So brilliant. Thank you very much for your time. I really do appreciate it. And people, viewers out there, thank you very much for watching. Really much appreciated. If you want to click like and subscribe. Sebastien, what's your social media handles? Do you remember?
yeah, I do. So the best way to reach me is at my website, which is decastell.com. So DECASTELL.com. I'm also, you can find me on Twitter at decastell on Twitter. But if you're having trouble spelling my name, just if you Google me, I'm super easy to find just because I have a weird name. So I'm almost always the first one that sort of turns up. So yeah, but the website's usually the best way to find me.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for watching, and we'll catch you again soon. Thank you. Bye.